Network. This is Face the State.
Good morning and thank you for joining us here on Face the State. I'm Shannon Newth coming to you today from our KTVH studios in Helena. And today we're talking about a tough subject, and that's one of suicide, and one in Montana that's been an issue for more than 40 years. We've ranked in the top states in the country for suicide deaths. And today we're talking about a movement that's happening across the state to help prevent suicide and examine the culture of suicide in Montana. I'm joined today by three people who are heroes and leaders in this movement of suicide prevention and looking at this topic. We have Matt Kuntz, Juliana Hollows, and Carl Roston. Thank you all for being here this morning.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. All right, so first let's go around. Let's introduce you, give people a background of what your position is and why you're passionate about that movement. Matt.
I'm Matt Kuntz. I'm the executive director for NAMI Montana, and I came into this field after losing a family member to suicide after he came home from Iraq, and I guess I've been in there ever since with NAMI and with the families that we work with. We are able to see a lot of the hardships suicide brings, but we're also able to see people recover from the deepest, darkest depression, and gives us a lot of hope as well.
Okay, and for those who don't know, can you tell us a little more about NAMI?
Yeah, we're the National Alliance on Mental Illness for Montana. It's a grassroots organization across the country. We're the Montana chapter, and we also have local chapters that do education and support groups in their communities.
Okay, great. Juliana.
I'm the suicide prevention coordinator for Montana Veterans Affairs, and I'm also a mental health counselor. And so I came into the field, or specifically into suicide prevention, because it really put together a lot of things that I'm personally vested in. I come from a family of veterans and active service members, and I also come with a family and have friends and have worked with many people that have struggled with mental illness. And so this particular job I thought would be a great place for me to put my own personal interest into, but also there is a lot of hope in suicide prevention, and I'm able to see what individuals can do to help save veterans, save their community members and their family members. And so I like that you brought up hope, because there's a lot to be had in suicide prevention.
Right, and ultimately at the end of our conversation today, we want to leave people with hope, and the fact that there is hope out there, there are resources out there, which of course we'll talk about throughout this next half hour. Carl, tell us about yourself.
I'm the suicide prevention coordinator for the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. I've been in that position for about 10 years. I'm also a mental health therapist. I've been a therapist for about 25 years. And I got into this because I'm also a survivor. I lost a sister to suicide about more than 30 years ago.
Okay. So we've been working over the past year diligently, and this movement's been happening for more than just the past year, but looking at suicide prevention in our state, looking at this issue, the problem of suicide, and why Montana is continually high for suicide rates. I've been working with the Cascade County Suicide Prevention Task Force there. There's really been a grassroots movement that's spreading across the state, and we've been sharing stories with our audiences in Great Falls and Helena for the past year about suicide prevention and those efforts. But let's talk a little bit about this movement and the fact that there's been this growing passion, this growing momentum to help really examine suicide and also then encourage those suicide prevention efforts. So let's talk a little bit about what this movement is from your perspective and how you've been involved in really trying to spur on suicide prevention in Montana. Well, Carl, we'll start with you this time.
Well, and it really has. I'd say in the last 2 or 3 years, the movement has really picked up. I think when I started this position 10 years ago, I felt very isolated, and I would have small segments in communities who would be advocates, and that has really grown, and it's grown to include entire communities, legislature, mental health field, and it's really taken off as far as raising the awareness and for people to understand that suicide is something that's very preventable if people know the warning signs and know how to intervene.
Mm-hmm. Juliana, with veterans, of course, that's a population that's an even higher rate within Montana, where we see those suicide numbers. Mm-hmm. What have you seen from this momentum?
Well, I remember 2 years ago when I started at the VA kind of feeling this daunting task, because our suicide rate among Montana veterans is 68 per 100,000, which is the highest in the nation. And really kind of had to stand back and say, I cannot do this alone. And my journey really started with Carl Roston and calling him and saying, what do we have going on? And what I found was community after community has really just started to build coalitions, get together and say, enough is enough. We need to talk about mental health. We need to talk about suicide and what it's doing to us and our families, and we need to get that help. And the other day, I was at a gun show handing out gun locks to veterans and individuals and talking about suicide prevention. And at first, I got nervous, thinking, oh my goodness, here I am talking about mental health, and I'm with a bunch of individuals that I don't know how they feel. And I was really impressed by how many people came up and were for gun safety, were for mental health, and were excited to see me there. And I would say that that's persistent when I call Billings or when I call Bozeman or when I call Sydney, Montana. There are people there and willing to work and to get out there. So for me, that's been exciting to see how much Montanans want this and are ready to work.
And you brought up the issue of gun safety, and that's something some of the leaders in this movement have said to me, is that obviously Montana, we're a state that loves our guns, and a lot of people have them. And so when you look at mental health, a lot of this is about gun safety versus trying to take away or other control methods. But for you, you're talking about the gun locks, it's about gun safety.
Exactly, about gun safety. I mean, I've yet to meet an individual that isn't for safety of their weapons. They want to protect them. They treat them very well. A lot of people's firearms have personal history and meaning to them, especially our veterans. And so at the VA and with our therapists, we really want to respect that relationship. And we want to respect Montana culture and say it is about gun safety. And how can we recognize when we're vulnerable and in a place where we need to ask for help or where we need to access help? And how can we keep ourselves safe as well as our hobbies or our firearms and things like that?
Sure.
And that becomes especially important with our youth also, not just veterans, because in Montana, 63% of the youth suicides are by firearm. That's almost double the national for the same age group. And what we do know about it is about 80% of the time the gun is owned by the parent. So the theme of really supporting safe storage of firearms is critical.
So Matt, we're talking about the movement and the momentum. Where have you seen it working with NAMI and in your personal relationships?
Yeah, it's been remarkable for me, and I think a big part of it is people's just willingness to step up and take action and say, I'm going to be a part of this. This is important for me and my community. And I go back to, there was a series of articles in the Billings Gazette about suicide, and it was a cold January day or night, and I was in a parking lot right outside my work, and Dr. Len Lance came up to me and was like, man, we got to do something. I got to do something. And that that conversation, I was like, we'll support you, whatever. That conversation led to the Montana Suicide Review Team, led to the Montana Conference on Mental Illness, and I see that with so many different communities, like in the Research Center at Montana State, which has brought the best youth suicide prevention program in the world to Montana. And it's the first time I've seen schools saying, we want this. We'll find a way to pay for it. Like we want to reduce our suicide rates, and it's not enough for us to get somebody else's cast off. We want the best. We want evidence-based, we want real deal. And it's been remarkable. I mean, a total shift, but a lot of it comes to people willing to take action, or on the flip side, so many people willing to say, hey, I battle depression. I mean, like I've talked about my own struggles with suicidal thoughts, because that movement picks you up, and all of a sudden you're not afraid of it, but you're willing to say, hey, we have this, like face this. This is something that you got to deal with, and figure out a way to help yourself get through for yourself and for your family and your community.
And you mentioned things happening within the schools, within our youth. Are there screenings, correct, that are happening or becoming more common or available to schools?
There are some schools that do screening. I think it's really important to focus on, there's two different ways that we look at, or that I look at suicide prevention, and like one-on-one with an individual, which can be screening, or it can be mental health treatment by a counselor, a psychiatrist, and then there's also like one-to-many, which is more suicide prevention, something like the Youth Aware Mental Health program that can happen in the schools.
The Out of Darkness walks
Yeah,
through the
I mean,
American
like,
Foundation of Suicide Prevention.
A lot of these things that are broader than just one-on-one, but it is neat to see, you know, you got a schools like in East Helena saying, we want the screening, we want the suicide prevention program, or you see other schools that say, we've only got this amount of time, this amount of money, but we're going to find a way to make it work.
You also mentioned that the idea that we all need to be foot soldiers, if you will, in this battle against suicide, against mental illness, things like that in the state, and that seems to be part of this movement that we've been talking about, is the fact that it's not just certain health professionals. It needs to be all of us that are advocating, that are willing to step up, that are willing to have conversations and be aware. How do we go about doing that as individual citizens? How can I talk to a friend of mine who might be struggling or might be saying, hey, I'm thinking about suicide? How do we all become foot soldiers in this battle?
You know, I guess what I think about is always remember that suicide hotline. You know, like that is the safety net. Whenever you engage with someone, whenever you talk with them, you always have that safety net of the suicide hotline, the 1-800-273-TALK. You know, like that's always there. If you get stuck and if you don't know what to do, call them. Make them work. They're not just there when it's total crunch time, but make them work. Like, hey, I need to talk to this person. What am I going to do? Or I'm just scared. I don't know what I'm going to say to my daughter or my spouse, but they're acting in a way. So I think to remember that you're not alone, and that call that number if you get stuck, but also that, you know, just having that conversation isn't really that much different than pestering somebody about their diabetes or their, you know, hey, you don't look that good. Are you getting your heart checked out? I mean, like something's going on, and this is just another health condition. And the second we realize that, we can handle it rationally and effectively.
And that's something I've been hearing too more, is the fact that we need to treat and look at mental health issues, depression, things like that, as any other ailment that our body might entail. And I think that's also a shift that's happening in how people are trying to approach and think about talking about depression and mental illness. That's something I've been hearing within this movement over the last couple of years. Either one of you, how we...
Well, just something I was going to say is I think it's important for us to understand, if we focus just on suicide prevention, we're missing the boat. Suicide is just the end result of a bigger issue, and that's the undiagnosed, untreated mental health issues. Nationally, the stats suggest that about 90% of the people who die by suicide have a diagnosable mental health issue. In Montana, it's about 83%. And the majority of the time, it's depression. 60 to 70% of the time that the person has a history of depression. And that is an issue that is growing. And not just in our state and our country, but even in the world. I mean, the World Health Organization is now suggesting by 2030, depression is going to be the #1 health issue in the world. So this is something that we have to start to address, and we also know that early identification has the best prognosis, and that's kind of where the screening comes in, because the average age of onset for someone who has depression or anxiety is usually somewhere between 12 and 15, and that is where we're advocating for people to start to take a look in screening kids. Because if we identify it at that age, it's much easier to treat than if you wait 20 or 30 years and suffer through it. So early identification is a key piece, and raising the awareness within our communities is essential.
Well, and I really liked how you kind of brought up the health perspective. When we have a loved one who is presenting with a cold, we're going to say, gee, you have the sniffles today. Would you like some chicken soup? Or, I mean, you're quick to take care of them. And Montanans are very quick to take care of each other. Yet when we bring up mental health, there's kind of this fog or stigma related to it. And sometimes people get nervous. They think, well, it's none of my business to ask them about their impending divorce or their mental health. But we really have to stop and say, no, I care about this individual, mentally and physically, and sometimes recognize those symptoms. Wow, I see that people can talk about, well, I haven't been able to get to work lately. I've been feeling really down. I've noticed that I've been thinking about not waking up in the mornings. And just by being able to kind of self-assess or look at the people around you and say, hey, how are you doing? we're able to get them to the screener. We're able to find people who might not know that they have depression or they have anxiety, they have something that is treatable. And those are really those first steps to preventing suicide.
I think one of the important things I know for me to grasp when I got into this field, and you're fielding all these calls and people are dying and you're trying to help, and is that it's irrational. Like suicide is an irrational action caused by a brain that's struggling with its neuron communications. Like that's what it is. And it's hard if you're someone that has depression or something, there's not a flag that goes up on your back or your head when you cross the difference between normal sadness or normal grief into depression. And that may be something that you need some help with, that you need your buddy or a family member to say, there's something going on and I'm worried, and that may be enough to say, let's go into the primary care doc and they'll see what's going on, because you're just not quite yourself anymore. Or we have education programs like Family to Family or Family to Support groups that help coach people in how to have those conversations.
When we talk about depression, a lot of times people who may have never struggled with it have a hard time grasping or understanding the difference between saying and depression and what it can do to you physically, mentally, emotionally. And Montana often has this saying, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps saying. How do we help people understand who maybe haven't had or gone through depression, or have but haven't recognized it in themselves? How do we help them understand a little more what it's like between sadness and depression?
I think education is a big piece of it, starting in our schools with some of the programs like Matt talked about. But I think our primary care, as far as depression screening, should become the next vital sign. We check oxygen rates and we check blood pressure and everything else. Right. Asking questions about depression, I think it helps normalize it to the point where people start to feel more comfortable about it. And that's a big issue in Montana because of that rugged, independent spirit we have. There's a sense of independence where we don't like to talk about our problems, and many times we see it as a weakness, or we see ourselves as a burden if we bring up those issues. And I think that's one of the reasons, one of the major things that changes or makes us different from other parts of the country is that we feel like we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to bring it up because people will view us differently. And what we have to get people to understand is that this is a normal thing. It's medically based, it's biologically based, and it's one of the most treatable. Just like Matt was comparing it to diabetes. Getting people to say, hey, I've been in this funk for 2 or 3 weeks now. I'm not sleeping. I've had a change in my appetite. I'm starting to isolate. I'm starting to pull away from people. Those aren't normal behaviors. And so once we start to recognize that, then we can start to, whether it's in our schools, whether it's our primary care, our communities, we start to recognize those and we can start to address those.
I think one of the other things is realizing that this isn't just this generation, that we have, Abraham Lincoln struggled with depression, Martin Luther King Jr., John Adams, Winston Churchill, all these incredible and amazing Americans. Elon Musk talks about his bipolar disorder. Whatever your field is, there is someone at the top of it that's dominating, that lives with depression. And some of it may make them stronger. Battling that battle every day does make you stronger. So I think realizing this doesn't make you weak. This doesn't make you a worse worker. It doesn't make you a worse family member. It might make you a little bit different, give you something else to manage, but it's also probably the most likely condition to create a monument for you on the nation's capital. Like half of those people live with depression.
Right.
So I think just that basic reality that this isn't new and it's not just you.
Right.
It's everybody.
And no one's immune to it. I think oftentimes we think that people with mental illness look a certain way or talk a certain way, but the truth of it is mental illness doesn't have one category of person. Every single person could potentially struggle with depression or anxiety or other things. And I love the more that we just make it normal and say, hey, I work and live with the following condition, it's fine. This is how I treat that or how I move forward. And at the VA, they have a system called Make the Connection, in which veterans or individuals for that matter can go on and watch videos of people still in military service with PTSD or with a diagnosable disorder being successful in their career, going to group counseling, doing individual counseling, and they can see, wow, these people are functioning and they're able to figure out their mental illness. And the big message for Make the Connection, or for what we're saying, is we don't want people to struggle alone or in silence, or to think that, you know, they're the only person that has this. There are very successful individuals who do get treatment and are able to work and live with mental illness.
And to kind of go back to one of your questions as far as what we can do as a community, we have to start off by confronting the stigma. The stigma that's out there concerning depression and suicide. And a lot of people feel very uncomfortable talking about the word suicide. There's a myth out there that people are afraid to bring up because they might put the idea in the person's head.
Right.
There's not 1 ounce of research to support that. On the contrary, asking somebody if they're suicidal actually validates their pain, gives them an opportunity to talk, offers hope. And so some of that is just challenging those perceptions that we have out there around suicide and depression, and to say that this is actually the best thing we can do is to talk to somebody and ask somebody, hey, are you okay? Are you thinking about suicide?
So let's talk about where we are seeing hope. What's happening within this movement, suicide prevention efforts that are happening now, because of course we talked about screening. Let's start by talking about our rural areas of Montana, because that's one of the challenges in Montana is the access to service. What are ways that service is being expanded? Maybe it's through telemedicine, things like that, where we're seeing suicide prevention resources going out into the rural areas. And on the flip side, what are some of the challenges for that as well?
Well, I can start a little bit just by what we're doing with some of our primary care. We do have a shortage of mental health services in Montana. We have a totally inadequate number of psychiatrists and counselors. So primary care is going to be a key component. So we offer trainings to especially nurses in primary care on how to do risk assessments and depression screens, and teach them safety plans and how to intervene with their clients or their patients, and ways to connect them to community resources, whether it's something like NAMI or a community mental health center or even their church. You mentioned telemedicine. We also have programs that, you know, luckily we're living in an age of expanding technology, so we have counseling services that are online now, or as you mentioned, telemedicine, telepsychiatry, telecounseling. Those are becoming more realistic, and especially in our rural areas.
One of the ones that I just am amazed by, which just was released in Montana this year, I think was the first state to be broadly tested, is computerized online cognitive behavioral therapy. Different models have proven to be as successful as actually going to a therapist. And Dr. Mark Schur from Montana State, you know, they released that this fall, and the pickup rate from all across the state on people that want, you know, this cost-effective online treatment from their home was astonishing. And it's really exciting, and I can't wait to see where that goes next, because we're on the front edge of that, and it's one of the more exciting things in a world where, you know, there's not necessarily funding for a ton of new treatment services. This is an option.
And just to kind of piggyback off that, one of the collaborations that we have done is with the University of Vermont and Dr. Erica Zuby over at the Ben's Clinic. We're now providing primary care and nurses with diagnostic tools that have been shown to be as reliable as talking to a psychiatrist. So even though we don't have the numbers of psychiatrists, we do have some of the tools that help our primary care be able to make assessments that are accurate.
How about for our veterans?
Well, I like that you brought up bringing it to the home. Montana is huge. I remember when I was talking to suicide prevention coordinators across the state, and I said, well, I have an outreach today. It'll take me 5 hours to get there. They don't really understand or grasp that Montana is the size of New England, and that we have veterans that live all over the state. In fact, we have one of the highest, you know, per capita rates of veterans anywhere. We have a huge National Guard, and so we have to bring counseling, bring help to them where they're at. And so we do offer telemental health through several of our clinics, on several of our clinics. Also within our communities, we provide that counseling as well. And we also partner a lot with communities and say, okay, how can we help and support you? So recently we've been selected for something called the Mayoral Challenge. And both the Billings and the Helena city mayors agreed to be a part of this Mayoral Challenge, in which their staff and their teams that they're going to put together are going to be trained in policy and development to then help support whatever's happening or whatever they decide to create within their communities. So if it's televising this awesome CBT program in the home, and how do we let all people in Lewis and Clark County know about this, then maybe that's what the community will develop. And with our veterans, the biggest thing that we want to let them know is we have the crisis line, we have our telemental health, and when I talk with my veterans, I want them to know that we want them to get care in whatever the way that they can get it. So we recently found out that 20 veterans a day die by suicide. And of those 20, 14 of them are not enrolled in the VA. So I don't know them. I don't know where they are or who they are. So we can't outreach, we can't find them and provide that suicide prevention without our communities. And so it takes groups like NAMI and primary care and all of those facilities, all those community coalitions that are working so hard to get those veterans and to help them find hope. And we know that the growth rate of suicide among veterans who are not receiving VA care is right around 38%, whereas veterans who are getting care, the growth rate is around 8%. And so we do know that if you're struggling and you get help, there's potential to get better and to feel that. And how you get better, I really think the veteran should have control over who they want to go to, who they see and what they do. And we provide a lot of things at the VA. And if we can't find it at the VA, we're going to help you find it wherever that is. And so I'm excited about the mayoral challenges, and I'm excited to hear things that Montana's putting together, because that's just more for our communities and veterans to access. And one other program is the GUARD put together, they said, you know, we need to do something more. And they put together that employee assistance program. And they worked with, I think they worked with you, correct?
Reliant Behavioral Health.
Yep, and they expanded that free counseling for veterans and GUARD members outside of the VA system, outside of the GUARD system, so that individuals who maybe weren't comfortable contacting those groups had another avenue to call and contact. And so I think Montanans are ready. We don't want to be number one for this anymore.
No, it's not a good thing to be number one at it all.
No.
Absolutely. Well, we're actually running out of time already. Of course, we have a lot more that we can discuss, but any final, just real quick words of hope for people?
Ask for help. It's, you know, depression is treatable, suicide is preventable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, there is, of course, hope out there, and we don't want our conversation to stop here. We'll be continuing to share stories of what's happening in Montana, of how we're continuing to look at the culture of suicide in Montana, prevention efforts that are happening. We have on our websites in Great Falls and Helena, KRTV, KXLH, we have various resources that are provided. We talked about the hotline, Veterans Affairs, things like that have their own set of resources. Department of Public Health and Human Services. There are resources available and out there, and it starts with all of us being more aware, more educated, and being willing to step up and talk with those. So we hope that you leave tonight today with some encouragement, because we're looking towards the future with hope. Thank you so much for joining us here for this edition of Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN.